Max Gorlin, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cripps from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, you got MJ from the Coaches Panel. Hope you're well and getting close to the end of the 40s anyway of the 50 most relevant. Yeah, almost 10 players through the 50 most relevant. In number 41 today, Patrick Cripps, the reigning Brownlow medalist. Joining me on this episode, he already has been a part of the 50 most relevant this preseason. You'll hear him plenty more. MiniMonk's back. Hello, buddy. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. It's good to be back on, and it's always an interesting chat about, the player that was the Brownlow medalist from the previous season. Should be a great one.
Yeah, he's an interesting cat, Blue, really, to talk about. 27 years of age. He's one of those guys that he feels like he's been around the footy scenes forever, but still on the edge of mid-20s. He's midfield only eligible. And last year, his top score in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam was a 139 against the Adelaide Crows, while in SuperCoach, his top score was against the Western Bulldogs. It was a 162. These are neither of those are anywhere near his career scores against those two formats. It was a 163 against the Gold Coast Suns in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and a 164 in SuperCoach. Both of those happen to be in the year of 2019. His average last year in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam was 102, meaning in those two formats, he's going to set you back over 900,000. 903K in AFL Fantasy and 926,400 in DreamTeam. While SuperCoach, 111.1, and he's going to sit you back more ones. Don't worry about it. SuperCoach 611,900, and my goodness, MiniMonk. Outside of making finals, there is not much more Patrick Cripps could have done from a personal perspective to get his beloved Blues into finals. He was spectacular last year.
Oh, he was phenomenal to watch. I mean, the guy really is what you want a midfielder to be at your club. Any team would love to have him as a player to complement their midfields. He has great burst from stoppage. He's got that perfect build where he's, nearly 2 meters tall. He's got pretty good skills with his foot. He tackles, he runs players down. I mean, he's a great player to watch, and he's a great fantasy and SuperCoach scorer as well.
Yeah, he certainly is. Look, last year he came third in the entirety of the AFL for clearances, stoppage clearances, and contested possession. That speaks exactly to what you're talking about. How if there's a ball to be won, and Patrick Cripps, chances are more than anyone else in the league, he's probably going to get one of those three. He also ranked in the top 20 for disposals, score involvements, and effective disposals per game. Some would kind of think that him and effective efficiency of the ball are synonymous. Well, in 2022, as MiniMonk's already highlighted, he absolutely was. From a fantasy footy perspective, in DreamTeam and AFL Fantasy, he scored 11 tons. 7 of those are over 120, including a 130, 138, and a 139. And he had an additional 7 scores, 84 and above. Now, that looks solid enough in and of itself. But his start of the year, in 6 of his first 7 games, he reached triple figures. And in that match he missed, that was that infamous game where he got subbed off at quarter time with some hamstring injuries that non-owners were thinking, finally a break. It's not gone my way. And then owners are going, thankfully, it was only a game and a bit missed before he was back. But in reality, in those first full 6 games he played, he averaged 125 in DreamTeam and Fantasy. And he enters into the year in 2023 with the 15th best average of all midfielders. So I suppose before we talk about his SuperCoach stats, which is historically MiniMonk been where he's been at his best, that's where people are probably quite excited about Cripps, is they remember that start to the year and think, there's still some fat on the bone here.
Yeah, I mean, 125 over a 7-round stretch with an injury in the middle as well. Comes back with a 123, backs it up with a 125 and a 130.
Amazing.
Like, that's crazy. You don't get players that do that very often. I mean, the only one that comes to mind is when Whitfield came back and got a 180 and then, manages to get himself injured the next week as well. But you look at that and you think 125 puts him, 5 points per game higher in average than what Rory Laird averaged for the entire season. And it's nearly 13 points higher than the second highest averaging AFL fantasy player from last year in Oliver. And you're telling me he's coming in priced at, 100s in the 100 range? Like,
Yeah,
that's
101.
That's value.
102.
That's a lot of value.
Crazy what he did in patches, and we'll talk about his patches of scoring in a second. But over in SuperCoach, he's even more prolific. From his 21 games, 13 tons, 8 of them over 120. 6 of those 13 tons were over 130, and that includes scores of, here's some game-breaking scores: 146, 151, and 162. If you've got that in your team with the VC or the C on it, you're heading for a good week or covering up a potentially horrific decision in cash cow roulette. Despite that injury that we've talked about, his start of the season was just dominant, that if you didn't have him, man, you were actually playing catch up over those first 8 weeks. Because over the first 7 weeks, if we want to drill into that, he scored 5 scores over 132. And even with that injury affected game of 38, he still averaged 125 over the first 7 matches. So if we were to break his season almost into thirds, rounds 1 to 8, he averaged 125.5 in SuperCoach and 112.4 in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam. In SuperCoach and AFL Fantasy, between rounds 9 to 18, this is where he got quiet. 94.3 in SuperCoach and an 87.8 in AFL Fantasy. But if you held on for the final 5 weeks of the year, Captain Cripper really rewarded you. Back to the 120 plus average with a 121.2 in SuperCoach between round 19 to 23. While in the same patch of time, 113 in AFL Fantasy. MiniMonk, everyone heralds that start of the year, but his end of the season was equally as strong.
Yeah, I remember everyone was scrambling around in round 2 and round 3 to bring him in both SuperCoach and Fantasy. Anyone who didn't start at him was, selling the farm to try and get their way to Cripps. And then everyone, I think, remembers that middle section of the season where he just didn't perform quite as well. And even I was looking at the stats today and came back and went, wow, he actually finished the season, in really good shape, really good scoring, and nearly got his team over the line to make finals. They just missed out. And I think he'll want to be righting that wrong and, trying to lead from the front and get them through again. And so, look, it's definitely an interesting split through the year. And I think it shows that there's a good time to jump onto him, and maybe there's a time to not be on the guy. You really got to time your runs with Cripps.
I think that's a good point. It also probably brings home the point that maybe sometimes these running at career high scores, which is really what he's doing in those back and front end of the year, when a guy's on a hot tear like that, that hard decision that we make mid-season, MiniMonk, is, do I jump on this guy? Is it a sustainable run, or do I keep hedging my bets and going against him and knowing that it hurts me? Because if you jumped on Cripps at round 9, you're getting that 94.3 from that time and missing the 125 in SuperCoach, while in AF and DT, you're getting that 87.8 and missing that 112. And that is a part of the strategy of the game, is timing when you get these big premiums in.
Absolutely. I mean, as much as your starting squad makes an impact on how you go in the season, you've got to pick the right time to jump onto these players. And that actually has much more of an effect than people like to think it does. It defines your season. Can you get on a player right before they have a big run, or are you jumping off a player right before they're going to, start falling off of the cliff? And I think with Cripps, you've really got to time those runs. And I think it's not just about, the teams that he's coming up to face and the form that he's in, but also, who's in him and around him in the team. I mean, he had to do a lot of things through the year where he probably wasn't playing just as a pure inside mid. He was having to push forward sometimes because they were, weak in their forward line stocks. He was having to chop out in the ruck when Pidney was injured. I mean, he had to, he wasn't just a pure inside mid. He was almost a Mr. Fix-It at times.
Yeah, and a lot of that time was in that middle bracket of the season too, between round 9 and 18. That was often where he was the Sally's all gap for the team, while the rest of the midfield were being quite well supported with Walsh, with Chera, with Hewitt. These guys, even Kennedy was playing a really important role through there as well. So how that midfield unit functions, and we'll talk about Sam Walsh's absence in a moment, is really fascinating to me. throughout the years of doing the 50 most relevant, we love getting guests on these podcasts. You've already heard Bales has been a guest on, and some more great guests lined up coming through the 30s right through to the end of the 50 most relevant. But one of the guests we've had on almost annually is the Statesman. If you listen to the Draft Doctors or the Point of Difference podcast, chances are you've heard his name. But for years now, he's been championing on both of these brands the curse of the winner of the Brownlow Medal. In essence, what that he's been saying is when you win a Brownlow Medal, pretty much you have the perfect year. You have a career high season, so to speak. And rarely can you reach those heights again. Not just in terms of winning a Brownlow Medal, although multiple people have done that, but in the sense of career high stats, career high score involvements, career high scoring columns, all being populated to its fullest. And if you go and look back from 2021 just through to 2016, so just looking at the past 6 Brownlow medalists, there's just one person who was just able to maintain what they did from their Brownlow year to the year following, but actually improve on that. And that was Patrick Dangerfield. He had a differential improvement of 6 points per game in SuperCoach. He took it up to a 136. So that was pretty crazy. And up by 2.6 in AFL Fantasy. But you start to look at the rest of these names, MiniMonk, Wines, Neil, Fife, Mitchell, Martin. These are all guys with huge fantasy pedigree, but all ranged anywhere from a failing of 6 points per game right up to 34.5 points per game differential. So that Brownlow Medal slide that Statesman talks about, it's pretty real.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is real. I mean, the stats don't lie. You tend to regress after you've had a banner year, and you don't want to be, starting a player like Cripps, if he's going to be, 30 points down on his previous year, that's going to really hurt you in your starting squad when you're searching for every little bit of value you can get. But then the devil's advocate for Cripps is, he got an injured game, which is affecting his average, affecting his price. And he had to play, as we talked about before, a different role for an extended portion of the season. And, maybe he can buck the trend. Maybe he can be the Dangerfield that has, maybe a couple of points of upside in fantasy and a few more in super coach, because he gets a more consistent role, and maybe he doesn't get injured for the year. And look, I think that makes him a very interesting prospect as to whether or not you pick him in your starting squad, or whether or not you think he's going to regress and you're going, no, Patrick Cripps, you can stay the hell out of my team to start off with. I don't want a piece of you.
Yep. No, and that's the beauty of statistics, isn't it? You can view them in all these different caveats. You can see the splits of what Brownlow medalists have done in their following year. You can see that middle portion of the year of Neil and go, of not Neil, sorry, of Cripps, and go, that's it, I'm out, I want nothing to do with him. Or as you've beautifully highlighted, going, oh, I'm going to get a Brownlow medalist that's got upside. I'm going to get a Brownlow medalist that everyone's going to be off. And now all of a sudden, I've got, at least according to the umpires, the best and fairest player in the league is now going to be unique in my side. And that's the beauty of fantasy footy, is we can all see things in a different light and come to elements of conclusions. What's interesting for me as I try to forecast through what Carlton does in 2023 is they've already confirmed that there won't be Sam Walsh, at least in the early portion of the year. Back in late December, they said they had no other alternative but to go with the surgery in his back. And so while the club hasn't given a definitive timeline of when he's back, they have said, look, he's not going to be playing the first month of the year. They'd be very surprised if he's playing the first month. So what does that mean for Cripps? MiniMonk, for me, that just screams increased responsibility on his shoulders.
Yeah, I mean, he's not going to be leaving the midfield rotation anymore. I mean, that's not going to be in the question. As long as they've got a fit forward line and a fit ruckman, he's going to be in there, 85% of CBAs. But the question is that the role do they have a role share between what Walsh and what Cripps do? And I think there's a slight bit of overlap, but, I think Walsh is a little bit more on the outside, a little bit more of a gut runner into space, whereas Cripps is, he's been called the inside bull. He works in and around the ball. And so maybe there's a little bit of upside there for Walsh being out for the first month, but you also don't pick a player at, $600K or, nearly $950,000 in these formats for the first month. You're picking them for the year. You want them to be in your side from round 1 to round 24.
Yeah.
That's if there's a little bit of upside there. Yeah, if there's a little bit of upside there with Walsh, it might be a nice reason to, sway you into starting them versus not starting them as if you're really on the fence. But I think if you've made your mind up on him, I don't think that the Walsh out's going to be the thing that tips you over the line.
Yeah, I agree. Look, there's only really one player that does affect Cripps' scores when that player is out, and it's not Walsh. It's George Hewitt, and it's actually not Hewitt playing, it's Hewitt's absence and what that does for him. Last year, they played 14 games together. Now, remember, this does include an injury impacted game in the data. So just factor that in when you're looking at it, but it does highlight the point. He averaged 94.5 in fantasy and dream team and 102.8 in SuperCoach when they played together 14 times. However, in the 7 games Hewitt didn't play, Cripps goes at a mouth-watering 117 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team and 128 in SuperCoach. We're talking a 22 to 25 points per game differential across the format. So if Hewitt's not there at the start, let alone Walsh, oh boy, now all of a sudden, you're starting to see that value that MiniMonk is really highlighting through this episode.
I think that makes a lot more sense with a player like Hewitt compared to a player like Walsh. I mean, they're both very Hewitt and Cripps are both very inside players. They both accumulate, a fair bit of their scoring through tackling and contested possessions and working the ball from the inside to the outside. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. Look, one of the reasons, and you've kind of alluded to it already, that a lot of people over the years have opted out of spending high 100 plus, average, or 110 average in other formats in SuperCoach at their starting squad, is they're like, he's just not reliable. He's injury prone. I want nothing to do with him. And they throw him out or they discard him. But the reality is he's just missed 3 games in the past 3 years. So staying on the park, staying with the narrative of I'm not picking him because he's injury prone, at least the most recent history we can go off, I don't know if that's fair. And even though he did miss a game and get injured mid-game with a hamstring, if you're going, I'm not picking him because he's injury prone, I don't think that argument is the watertight one. Now, maybe it might be the differential of you're looking at someone like Clayton Oliver versus Cripps, and you're going, durability is the ultimate decider. Okay, fine. But if that's the only flag reason for not starting Cripps, I don't think that's compelling enough for me. But what's your take on him? Like, MiniMonk, is he in your starting squad considerations, or is he very much an upgrade target?
I think I view him more as an upgrade target for the coming fantasy season. I don't think that there's enough consistency, enough of a inbuilt value, enough of an upside that I can see in him for him to be a player that defines your season like he was last year. I mean, he came in at such a discounted price last year, which is why everyone was scrambling to get him. But this year, he's coming in at a very top premium price where you're paying a similar price to, players like Bontempelli and McRae and Josh Kelly. And there's just enough other options around him and enough question marks over the player that you probably are leaning away from starting him. I wouldn't begrudge anyone who wanted to start him, especially in SuperCoach. I think SuperCoach, he's shown that he can go on runs of, 120 plus, 125 plus, 130 plus. He's an out and out vice captaincy and captaincy choice every week.
Absolutely.
But I view him more as an upgrade candidate. And he's someone that, he might make our way into our teams at the end of the season, especially, they come in with the last bye. There's a stacked bye, but, he might have a run from round 17 to round 24 where he's like, I need to drag Carlton over the line. I need to be the absolute best player that I can be, or maybe even to get him into the top 4.
Yeah.
And I can see him going for a run in a period of the season where he's going, 120 AF, 130 SuperCoach, and you want to be on him for that run.
Yeah.
But it's about finding when that run's going to be. And geez, that's going to be a big question.
That's it. I agree. And I think for me, because of the patchiness of how he scores and the price you're starting with him, you've got to bank on that patchy hot streak. And maybe patchy is an unfair word on him. That hot streak of weeks You're banking on that coming out of the absolute start and then riding the wave of historically when he has a quiet 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. So for me, I agree. I think you're banking him at the start and you're hoping it's that hot streak bang starts big on that Thursday night game against the Tigers like he did in 2022, or you're just positioning yourself for that 30s game, that 40s game, that 50s game where things don't go his way and you're going to jump on and get him as a great upgrade target. Because either way, starting squad or upgrade target, he's relevant because he can take a patch of games away from you, as MiniMonk so well positioned for us. Let's talk about what he does on draft day. Last year in Ultimate Footy, he had an average draft position 43. I know that sounds early, but based on the fact that he finished as the 15th best midfielder in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and the 12th best average in SuperCoach, that meant you got some real value for money based on what you spent as a drafting spot. I've got a take. I'm not sure what you're thinking, a MiniMonk, but I think he'll go M2 across the formats. I wouldn't draft in there in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam formats, so I'll explain why in a sec. But across the formats, I think he goes at M2 based on that. Where do you think he goes on draft day?
I think you're about right. I think maybe someone might take him as an M1 in SuperCoach, but I can't see him going before an M2 in AFL Fantasy. And there's also going to be a lot of name value around him as well. I mean, he's coming off a Brownlow. There's a lot of people that are going to see the name and see what he's done for stretches in the season and go, yep, I'll take him. I know what he's like. He's consistent. I probably wouldn't want him as an M2 in AFL Fantasy. It'd be, it's a very risky one. But maybe if it's a very late M2 and you've backed it up, with a really strong forward like one of the Dunkleys, Tarantos, Rosie's types, and you've got another really good midfielder, then having Cripps there as your M2 probably doesn't hurt quite as much. But yeah, in SuperCoach, I think he's very clearly in that early to mid M2 range. Yeah,
I think so. Look, ranked underneath him based on averages from last year, Steele, Kelly. I'm finding every way I can to get Josh Kelly into the 50 most relevant. Don't worry, friends. Ollie Wine, Sam Walsh, and Darcy Parish. So even though they're ranked beneath him by average, I just don't see enough guys underneath that will push him out of the top 20 mids based on where people will draft in SuperCoach. So you're right. I think he goes M2 there. And then AFL Fantasy, the reason I'd choose him as an M3 is because beneath him are Kelly, Mitchell, Simpkin, Parish, Bontempelli, and Noah Anderson. Yeah, that's a few just names. Within, some good names. And just in my personal rankings, I've got them all, I think, performing stronger than Cripps this year. And so for me, it probably means I'm like you. I'd like to draft him in an M3 spot unless I'm going really heavy on another line. And that just means based on where others will rank him, I think he'll go most probably inside the top 20 mids. So that's an M2. And so in drafts, I'll probably miss him based on that ranking. But I suppose that's the beauty of drafts, isn't it, MiniMonk? We all rank and view these players in different ways.
Yeah, and it only takes one person to draft a player. I mean, you're in a 10-team league. None others might be like, I don't want a piece of him until he's an M3. And one person might say, no, I think he's got upside. I'm going to take him in M2. And I don't think I want to be the person that does that. Not in AFL Fantasy, but in SuperCoach, maybe. But yeah. I think it's, someone else. You can take the risk. Not my problem.
It all depends on, it takes, like you said, not just one person to draft, but one person to be keen, jump that little bit extra early in a SuperCoach. If you're in the second round and all of a sudden you've landed yourself one of those big premium scoring rucks that others have scared off, or you've gone and got yourself that big forward or a really big option that's like, a late M1 might not be the worst if you secure some other stuff. So that's the beauty of drafts, is we all draft differently and rank people in different ways. Hey, MiniMonk, as always, mate, I appreciate your work and your support on this podcast.
No, thanks for having me on. It's really good to chat about him, and I'm sure I'll be chatting to you sometime in the future.
Absolutely, you will. If you want to go and read the article on Patrick Cripps, maybe you want to dive into a little more depth of those Brownlow statistics, I've got them all for you online now and at coachespanel.tv. You can go and check that out. In 30 seconds, I'm going to give you a clue who's in at number 40 of the 50 most relevant. But if you've been loving these podcasts, they've become a part of your daily fantasy footy diet, we'd love you to make sure you're following and subscribing wherever you're listening to this podcast and leaving a 5-star rating and review. Encourage you, if you haven't done so, tell a mate that loves your fantasy footy too about the Coaches Panel and these podcasts and articles. And of course, you can join our Patreon subscriber group. It is where you get a bunch of exclusive content, access to hidden groups, and you even get these podcasts 24 hours early if you become a breakout or a premium tier supporter. All the links to become a patron, you can find at coachespanel.tv. So who's in at number 40 of the 50 most relevant? I'll give you 2 clues. Number 1, they scored a ton in their very first game of AFL. Number 2, they're heading into the infamous 3rd year breakout. And if you're kind of curious, did they have a scoring regression in year 2 or did they go up? They went up. Who am I talking about? Who's at number 40 of the 50 most relevant? You'll find out tomorrow here at the Coaches Panel.